Welcome everyone to my dramatic reading of Pride and Prejudice versus Zombies. If you don't know me, my name is Mars. If you do know me, just go with it. And I thought it would be perfect to get into the spooky season and read some spooky books. You guys probably all know Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and then the Zombies part by Seth Graham Smith. It's actually a funny little quip at the back of it. It says, Jane Austen is the author of Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, Mansfield Park, and other masterpieces of English literature. Seth Graham Smith once took an English class. He lives in Los Angeles. So here we go. I think let's get started in Pride and Prejudice versus Zombies. And welcome to my dramatic reading. It's gonna take I'm gonna do this over the next while, hopefully finishing on Halloween. So stick with me and we'll read it together, alright? So, Chapter 1. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a zombie in possession of brains must be in want of more brains. Never was this truth more plain than during the recent attacks at Netherfield Park, in which a household of 18 was slaughtered and consumed by a horde of the living dead. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is occupied again?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not, and went about his morning business of dagger sharpening and musket polishing, for attacks by the unmentionables had grown alarmingly frequent in the recent weeks. "But it is," she returned. Mr. Bennet made no answer. Do you want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "Woman, I am attending to my musket. Prattle on if you must, but leave me to the defense of my estate." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune, that he escaped London and chaise, just as the strange plague broke through the Manchester line." "What's his name?" "Bingley, a single man of 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls." "How so? Can he train them in the way of swordsmanship and musketry?" "How can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of marrying them off one day." "Marriage? In these times? Surely this Bingley has no such designs." "Designs? Nonsense! How can you talk so? It is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes." "I see no occasion for that. And besides, we mustn't busy the roads more than absolutely necessary, lest we lose more horses and carriages to the unfortunate scourge that has troubled our beloved Hertfordshire of late." "But consider your daughters." "I am considering them, silly woman. I would much prefer their minds be engaged in the deadly arts than clouded with dreams of marriage and fortune, as your own so clearly is. Go and see this Bingley if you must, though I warn you that none of our girls has much to recommend them. They are silly and ignorant like their mother, the exception being Lizzie, who has something more of a killer instinct than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me, oh vexer, vexen. You have no compassion for my poor nerves." "My mistake, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard little else of these last 20 years, at least." Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick part, sarcastic humor, reserve, and self-discipline that the experience of 3 and 20 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. They're not really painting a nice picture of this woman, are they? When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. When she was nervous, as she was nearly all the time the first outbreak of the strange plague in her youth, She sought solace in the comfort of the traditions, which now seemed mere trifles to others, living in the past. The business of Mr. Bennet's life was to keep his daughters alive. The business of Mrs. Bennet's was to get them married. I guess to, keep them alive and then also to procreate the next generation. Anyways, Chapter 2. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he would not go until the evening after the visit was paid. She had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in carving the Bennet crest in the handle of a new sword, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, mamma." "Oh, wait, that's But you forget, mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the next ball." Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. You sound as if you've been stricken." "Mother, what a dreadful thing to say with so many zombies about," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" Tomorrow night. Tomorrow fortnight." "Aye, so it is," cried her mother, "and it will be impossible to introduce him, since we will not know him ourselves. Oh, how I wish I had never heard the name Bingley." "I am sorry to hear that," said Mr. Bennet. "If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he had wished, that of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. "Oh, how good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet! But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased am I, as it is such a good joke too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now." "Do not mistake my indulgence for relaxation of discipline," said Mr. Bennet. "The girls shall continue their training as ever, Bingley or no Bingley." Of course," cried Mrs. Bennet. "They shall be as deadly as they are fetching. Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mrs. Bennet. And as she spoke, "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke, he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," she said when the door was shut. "Such joys are scarce, since the good Lord saw fit to shut the gates of hell and doom to the dead to walk amongst us. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am also the most proficient in the art of tempting others." Tempting the other sex. I thought it was going to say tempting others with sex, but... The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon Mr. Bingley would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Chapter 3. So, I'm just going to check how long. 9 minutes, not bad. Now, I know I'm not, the best at reading. I'm going to get better as I go along. I stutter, I get a little too far ahead of my words. Sometimes I read things, over and over again. But just go with it. I'm going to add my own little notes in here and there, so whatever. It is what it is. Yes. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject, was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favourable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, and, to crown the whole, he meant to be at the ball next, with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful.
If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield, said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, and all others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for.
And if I can see all 5 of them survive England's present difficulties, then neither shall I, he replied. In a few days Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of young ladies, and whose beauty and fighting skills he had heard much of, but he only saw the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat, rode a black horse, and carried a French carbine rifle upon his back, quite an exotic weapon for an Englishman. However, from his clumsy wielding of it, Elizabeth was quite certain that he had little training in musketry, or any of the deadly arts. How do you make it there on horse, Where are the zombies so far? I'm wondering. Come on, zombies. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that they were ready to credit her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it to all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honour of the invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have had in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by stating the idea of his being gone to London only to retrieve a large party for the ball. He's just going to bring a lot of people. And a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. Ooh, it's going to be a big old party. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted by hearing that instead of 12, he only brought 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. No problem there, all right. His 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the ball, it consisted of only 5 altogether. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance, and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women with an air of decided fashion, but little in the way of combat training. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mind, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance of his having slaughtered more than 1,000 unmentionables since the fall of Cambridge. Proficient killer, handsome, sign me up. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man, and the ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley. And he was looked at with great admiration until his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased. Mr. Darcy. Alright, well, Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. And though he lacked Mr. Darcy's proficiency with both sword and musket, such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast! Mr. Darcy was the proudest and most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody had hoped that he would never come there again. Ha! Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behaviour was sharpened into particular restraint by his having slighted one of his daughters. I don't know. Should Mrs. Bennet have more of like a Moira Rose voice? Jolly Mr. Darcy. I don't know. We could do it. We'll try. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged by the scarcity of the gentlemen to sit down for 2 dances, and during that part of the time, Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes, to press his friend to come join. "Come, Darcy," he said, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room who I would not be a punishment to me, who would, wow. And there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with. What a douche." "Upon my honor," cried Mr. Bingley, "I have never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them you see uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I've ever beheld, but there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own, and coldly said, "She's tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. I am in no humour, and at present, to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Wow. See, I didn't know this guy was so full of himself. I've never read it. As Mr. Darcy walked off, Elizabeth felt her blood turn cold. She had never in her life been so insulted. The warrior code demanded that she avenge her honor. Elizabeth reached down to her ankle, taking care not to draw attention. There, her hand met the dagger concealed by her dress. She meant to follow the proud Darcy outside and open his throat. Damn, look at this picture. Look at that picture. She means business right now. But no sooner had she grabbed the handle of her weapon than a chorus of screams filled the assembly hall, immediately joined by the shattering of window panes. Oh, I guess that picture was a spoiler. Sorry, guys, that's zombies. I didn't notice that. I thought she was I just saw her with the dagger. Well, whatever. But no. Unmentionables poured in. Unmentionables. Why do they call them that? It's zombies. Zombies poured in. Their movements clumsy yet swift. Their burial clothing. I guess they call them unmentionables because they're sophisticated. They're too sophisticated to call them the undead. So the unmentionables poured in. Their movements clumsy yet swift. Their burial clothing in arrangement and tidiness. Some worn gowns so tattered as to render them scandalous. Others wore suits so filthy that one would assume they were assembled from little more than dirt and dried blood. Their flesh, in varying degrees of putrefaction, the freshly stricken were slightly green and pliant, whereas the longer dead were grey and brittle. Their eyes and tongues long since turned to dust, and their lips pulled back into everlasting skeletal smiles. A few of the guests who had the misfortune of being too near the windows were seized and feasted on at once. When Elizabeth stood, she saw Mrs. Long struggle to free herself as two female dreadfuls bit into her head. Cracking her skull like a walnut. And sending a shower of dark blood spouting as high as the chandeliers. Oh my God. As guests fled in every direction, Mrs. Bennet cut through the commotion. "Girls! Pentagram of death!" Oh, I guess that's what we're seeing there in the picture. The pentagram of death. And Elizabeth immediately joined her four sisters, Jane, Mary, Catherine, and Lydia, in the center of the dance floor. Each girl produced a dagger from her ankle and stood at the tip of an imaginary five-pointed star. From the center of the room, they began stepping outward in unison, each thrusting a razor-sharp dagger with one hand, the other hand modestly tucked in the small of their back. From a corner in the room, Mr. Darcy watched Elizabeth and her sisters work their way outward, beheading zombie after zombie as they went. He knew only one of the other women in all of Great Britain who wielded he knew of only one other woman in all of Great Britain who wielded a dagger with such skill, such grace, and deadly accuracy. I wonder if it was the Queen. By the time the girls reached the walls, of the assembly hall, the last of the unmentionables lay still. Apart from the attack, the evening altogether passed off pleasantly for the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. I don't know what that means. Jane was as much as gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Mrs. Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighbourhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough never to be without partners, which was all that they had yet learnt to care for at the ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were of the principal inhabitants. Well, I guess nobody else lives in there. All right. Chapter 4. This one's a quick one, so I'll just read it. But I'm probably going to end this one soon, because we're getting a bit long. What are we at? 21. Oof, yeah. Chapter 4. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister just how much she admired him.
"He is just what a young man ought to be," she said, "sensible, good-humoured, lively.
And I never saw such happy manners.
So much ease, with such perfect good breeding."
"Yes," replied Elizabeth, "but in the heat of battle, neither he nor Mr. Darcy were found with blade or bludgeon."
"Well, I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I do not expect such a compliment."
"He certainly is agreeable, and I give you leave to like him, despite his lack of gallantry.
You had liked many a stupider person."
"Dear Lizzie!"
"Oh, you are a great deal apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anyone. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in your life."
"I would not wish to be hasty in censoring anyone."
"With your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. You like this man's sisters too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his."
They were, in fact, very fine ladies, not deficient in the power of making themselves agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town. He knew little of the deadly arts, but knew deadly of the had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, but knew little of the deadly arts in which she and her own sister had been so thoroughly trained, both in England and during their trips to the Orient. As for Mr. Bingley himself, between him and Mr. Darcy there was a very steady friendship, in spite of great opposition of character. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, and fastidious, and his manners, though well bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually given offence. But what no one, not even Mr. Bingley, knew was that the reason behind Darcy's cold demeanour. For until recently he had been the very picture of pleasantry, a young man of merry disposition and utmost attractiveness. But his nature had been forever altered by a betrayal he had not the stomach to speak of. Ooh. And with that, we'll leave it on a cliffhanger. Welcome again to Pride and Prejudice versus Zombies. This is by Jane Austen and Seth Graham, a dramatic reading by yours truly. Welcome to the spooky season, and I hope you guys join me for the rest. All right.